How did I feel when I heard the result? Well, really quite surprised. I'd assumed that when people got into the voting booth, Hilaire Belloc's phrase would come to the fore: carefully hold the hand of nurse for fear of something even worse. And yet in the end there was quite a clear majority for leave. Quite a surprise. A personal story to share. Well, when Mr. Cameron announced the date for the referendum, I sent my 3 children an email saying, I look forward to the debate. This is going to be a historic moment. I am inclined, as of now, to vote out, but let's see how the debate evolves. And I shared that with 3 friends, and one of them sent it on to his 50 best friends, and the next thing I knew, the sky fell in. These people were rounding on me for being xenophobic, ignorant, stupid, and then after a few weeks started to needle me for when I was going to either see the error of my ways or reply. And I took a long time to think about it. And then a few weeks, maybe 2 months, I set out to write what I thought would be a 2-pager, ended up as 10 pages, trying to think through why my initial instinct was what I still believed. And so in the end I voted to leave. And most of those people still regard me as, I don't know, having betrayed a fine cause, I suppose is the way they would put it. You ask what will improve from March the 19th regardless of the deal. I think it's impossible to answer regardless of the deal. The deal on the table at the moment will mean no improvement whatever. In fact, we will be worse off than we were before. What I'd hoped for was that the UK would recover control of its own laws and its own parliament, sovereignty, and in the process be able to adopt a much more free trade approach to our neighbours and to the world than seems to be the case with the Brussels regime. Underlying view I have of Brussels is that its instincts are protectionist, to protect the producer, the EU producer, at the expense of the consumer. And so I was hoping, when I voted to leave, that we would be able to leave the single market and the customs union and trade on our own. I'm historically minded. I think back to Robert Peel and the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s, which was itself very disruptive of the government of the day and of the Conservative Party, but in the end was a historic change in favor of opening our borders to free trade. Has the result changed the way I see the UK in the world? It's hard to say. I had hoped for a much enhanced place for the UK in the world. I'd hoped that a UK independent of Brussels and the EU would be able to be a better neighbour with our friends on the continent, and to be able to make our own way as a free trading nation, which is our historical role if you go back in history. Sadly, the deal presently on the table looks as though we will have the worst of all worlds, and so it could well be that the UK ends up a lot worse. The question of whether the vote reflected people feeling disenfranchised, maybe outside London and the southeast, yes, I'm sure that was part of the motivation. But I have a lot of thoughtful friends in London and the southeast who voted leave as I did. I think it's a much more complex set of motivations for why people voted leave than simply that they were from the north or were not metropolitan people. Undoubtedly, in some areas where of very high immigration in the north, that was a strong motivation. People were worried about jobs. There may even have been some xenophobia. But the people I know and the people I've discussed it with were much more concerned with two things. One, positively to get control of our own sovereignty, if you will, control of our own ability to take the country forward. And whether in the context of free trade or diplomatic and security relations as well. The other is the direction that the EU has been taking over the last 30 years, a more and more political project. We didn't realize in this country that the Treaty of Rome was serious when it said ever closer union. When I voted to join the EU in the 1970 whichever for referendum, I thought we were joining a trading bloc. And the way in which, particularly under Delors and Mitterrand and Kohl, the euro was introduced and almost wished on us in Britain, said to me this was a political project of a kind that felt very uncomfortable and has become ever more uncomfortable. And in a way, I suppose a lot of us feel, I certainly felt, this is a club that I don't want to belong to any longer. The instincts seem protectionist and ever more centralizing, ever more regulating. And a bit like the Americans in 1776, I would like to be in charge of the UK, to be in charge of its own destiny. Do I have one word to sum up how I feel today? I don't think I do. What's going on in Parliament as we come up to the special vote is pretty depressing, highly confusing. My hope now, in the circumstances where it looks as though an improved deal cannot be negotiated in the time available, is that we leave with what is called no deal. And I don't regard it as a no deal, I regard it as a World Trade Organization deal, a WTO deal. And if we could do that, it would be very positive. So I suppose if you want one word, I still would like to feel positive. I think a second referendum would be a very serious rowing back on the first referendum. The first referendum was enabled by an act of Parliament, and the people were given their chance to vote on a yes-no question. So the second, calling for a second referendum, which would require another act of Parliament, would be to say the people were not trusted first time round. And I think that would be a very serious denigration of democracy in this country. And moreover, there's a very serious question. What would be the question on a second referendum? It's very hard to imagine how Parliament could agree on the wording, which would presumably be a prerequisite for a new act. So I would have thought that a second referendum is out of the question, as indeed the Prime Minister has said. Were there to be a second referendum along the lines of the first one, my instinct is that the answer would be the same, but who knows? I think the surprising thing about the whole debate has been the way that the government and the civil service, whose instincts have been to remain in the EU, that was the original recommendation of Mr. Cameron, And from the moment the referendum was announced, we've had a series of reports from the Treasury, the Bank of England, the OECD, the IMF, saying how very bad it would be to leave the EU economically, how every household would be worse off, how our trade would collapse, how we would go into recession, how foreign domestic investment would dry up, and so on. Well, it didn't happen after the referendum, contrary to what the then Chancellor, Mr. Osborne, had predicted. True, sterling came down, and if anything, the economy continued to do rather well. In fact, with the help of the sterling depreciation, exports were well up. Since then, the economy has performed well. We've seen no hint of the recession that was predicted. And I believe that will remain the case after the March the 29th. And it comes down to the underlying economic analysis. The people saying how bad it will be are using an economic approach called the gravity-weighted approach to trading relations, as if trade only works well or works so much better with your immediate neighbors. But Britain's not that kind of economy. We're now only about 10–12% of our economy is manufacturing, and our manufacturers export worldwide, and our service industries export worldwide, and the gravity approach adopted by the Treasury and the Bank of England is not the one to employ in our context. On the contrary, if you take a more free trade and open borders approach to the economic analysis, you can argue that actually, if anything, our economy will improve and benefit. And I find it very striking that the people that I know who are in favor of leaving are the entrepreneurs, the people running their own businesses, often small businesses, but not always. People like Dyson and Bamford running very big businesses. And the Remain businesses are those who've invested very heavily in lobbying in Brussels, and for whom the status quo is a competitive defense against the small guys. And so my own bet is the country will become more competitive once we have our own freedom.